My name is Loveleen Bhular and I'll be presenting the module Regulation of Wetlands. Before we start the presentation, a brief background on the definition of wetlands. Wetlands are defined as areas of land that are temporarily or permanently covered with water. They may be natural or artificial or man-made. They may be freshwater wetlands or brackish wetlands. Examples of wetlands include bogs, fens, swamps, marshes, floodplain and shallow lakes. Wetlands perform very important functions, and these include flood and erosion control, water purification and shoreline stabilization. However, wetlands are confronted with a number of problems, and these are the result of pollution, hunting, human settlement, agricultural drainage, fishing, woodcutting, watershed degradation, soil erosion, siltation and diversion of water supplies. And one of the main causes of many of these problems is the lack of awareness about the role of wetlands in the ecosystem. The objective of this presentation is to familiarize you with the international legal framework concerning wetlands, the domestic legal framework which includes legislation as well as judicial decisions, and to also introduce you to the domestic policy framework concerning wetlands. At the international level, we have a Convention on Wetlands of international importance, especially as waterfowl habitat from 1971. This is more popularly known as the Ramsar Convention. There are several unique features of the Ramsar Convention. Firstly, it is the only multilateral environmental agreement for a specific ecosystem, a habitat type, wetlands, rather than a species. The other important feature of the Ramsar Convention is that the call for the convention was not made by countries in the first instance, but rather by a group of non-governmental organizations which comprised the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, also known as the IUCN, the International Waterfowl and Wetlands Research Bureau or the IWRB, and an NGO known as BirdLife International. The third interesting feature of the Ramsar Convention is that it is not affiliated with the United Nations system of multilateral environmental agreements, which comprises of other conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, etc. The primary objective of the Ramsar Convention is to conserve and to enhance wetlands. It has 163 parties, all of which have a national Ramsar committee. The Ramsar Convention protects at least 2,000 sites which comprise a total surface area of several hectares. Now, under the convention, a number of criteria, guidance and guidelines have been adopted from time to time to interpret the text of the convention as well as to facilitate its implementation. An implementation review of the convention takes place every 3 years at the conference of the parties to the convention, and the last COP, COP 11, took place in Bucharest in July 2012. The definition of the wetlands under the conventions is important to understand. It defines wetlands as areas of marsh, fen, peatland or water, whether natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth of which at low tide does not exceed 6 meters. It may incorporate riparian and coastal zones adjacent to wetlands and islands or bodies of marine water which are deeper than 6 meters at low tide lying within the wetlands. It's quite a comprehensive definition of wetlands, but there are certain limitations to this definition. Firstly, it does not reflect the different types of wetlands that exist. Secondly, it does not reflect the dynamic nature of wetlands. For example, we know that wetlands are susceptible to seasonal and time-related changes, and further, it is not always possible to delineate the precise boundaries of a wetland. Unfortunately, these characteristics of a wetland are not reflected in the definition that is included in the Ramsar Convention. Now, under the Ramsar Convention, there is a document known as the Ramsar List, which includes a list of wetlands of international importance which are protected under the Ramsar Convention. This includes 42 different types of wetlands which have been grouped into 3 categories. First is the marine and coastal wetlands. Secondly, inland wetlands, and third, human-made wetlands. There is a criteria for designation of wetland sites under the Ramsar Convention, which divides wetlands into 2 primary groups, Group A and Group B. Group A includes sites containing representative, rare or unique wetland types, whereas Group B comprises of sites of international importance for conserving biodiversity. In Group B, 2 criteria are followed. One is a general criteria and the other is a specific criteria. The general criteria is based on the species and ecological communities in a wetland, whereas the specific criteria is based on water birds and fish. This list was adopted in 1990 and it was subsequently updated. The parties to the Ramsar Convention are required to designate at least one suitable wetland within their territory for inclusion in the Ramsar list. Now, the selection of this wetland is based on its international significance in terms of ecology, botany, zoology, limnology or hydrology, but this designation is without prejudice to the sovereign rights of parties. What this means is that although a wetland which is included in the territory of a member country is being included as a Ramsar wetland, the rights of the party concerned over the area of the wetland remain secured. Countries are also free to either delete or restrict a listed wetland on grounds of urgent national interest. But where this is done, it is required that they compensate for any loss of wetland resources, for example, by establishing additional natural reserves. Parties are also required to take into consideration their international responsibilities for the conservation, management and use of migratory stocks of waterfowl. The important concept which is included in the Ramsar Convention is the concept of wise use. Basically, the parties agree to formulate and implement their planning so as to promote the conservation of the wetlands included in the list, which is the Ramsar list, and as far as possible, the wise use of wetlands in their territory. This emphasizes that human use of wetlands on a sustainable basis is entirely compatible with the Ramsar principles and with wetland conservation. It applies to all wetlands and water resources in a party's territory, not only to those sites designated as wetlands of international importance under the convention, but the requirement of the state is restricted to being as far as possible. It's not an absolute requirement. Subsequently, a new definition of wise use was adopted under the Ramsar Convention. What it means is maintaining the ecological character of a wetland, which is achieved through the implementation of an ecosystem approach within the context of sustainable development. Guidelines have been developed under the Ramsar Convention for the implementation of this concept of wise use. The parties to the Ramsar Convention undertake a number of basic commitments. The first is to formulate and implement wetland conservation and their wise use. Second is to establish nature reserves. Third is to endeavor to increase waterfowl populations. And they also to ensure that parties are informed of any actual or likely change in ecologic character of any kind of listed wetlands and then to pass on this information to the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention. An important record maintained under the Ramsar Convention is the Montreux record. Basically, this is a register of the wetland sites under the Ramsar Convention which are listed on the Ramsar list, where changes in ecological character have occurred, are occurring, or are likely to occur as a result of technological developments, pollution, or other human interference. The Convention also envisages the provision of financial assistance to improve its implementation, particularly by developing countries and countries with economies in transition. This is known as the Ramsar Small Grants Fund for Wetland Conservation and Wise Use, which was earlier known as the Wetland Conservation Fund.